Imagine, it's the early 1940s. The world is on fire, engulfed in the flames of the Second World War. America is positioning itself as the arsenal of democracy, a beacon of freedom fighting against tyranny. But that beacon casts long, dark shadows for millions of African Americans. The promise of liberty and justice for all felt like a distant, hollow echo. This was the era of Jim Crow, a time of deeply entrenched racial segregation that permeated every aspect of American life. From water fountains and movie theaters to schools and neighborhoods, the nation was split in two, separate and profoundly unequal. This division wasn't just a civilian issue. It was deeply embedded in the very institutions meant to protect the nation's ideals, including the United States military. While young men were being called to serve and fight for freedom overseas, African American soldiers were often relegated to service and support roles like cooks, drivers, or laborers. The idea of them serving in high-stakes, prestigious combat positions was not just dismissed. It was actively opposed. The prevailing belief, tragically, was that they were simply not capable. Nowhere was this prejudice more pronounced than in the glamorous, high-tech world of military aviation. Flying a fighter plane was seen as the pinnacle of skill, courage, and intelligence. It was the stuff of heroes. But according to the military's top brass and influential studies of the time, African Americans were deemed to lack these very qualities. A deeply racist and utterly baseless 1925 study from the Army War College, for instance, concluded that black people were inherently subordinate, mentally inferior, and lacked the initiative and resourcefulness needed for combat leadership. It was a pseudo-science of prejudice, a carefully constructed barrier designed to keep the cockpit and the prestige that came with it exclusively white. These weren't just opinions whispered in back rooms. They were official doctrines that shaped military policy. The message was clear. African Americans were not fit to fly. They were told they didn't have the coordination, the technical aptitude, or, most insulting, the bravery to handle the complexities of aerial combat. This institutional racism created a formidable wall, seemingly impossible to scale. It was a narrative that denied opportunity based on the color of skin, not the content of character or the measure of skill. It was a system that said, "You can die for your country, but you cannot fly for it." But history is often shaped by those who refuse to accept the limitations placed upon them. In the face of this systemic discrimination, a powerful movement for change was brewing. Civil rights leaders, the black press, and determined advocates began to challenge this hypocrisy. They asked a simple but powerful question: how could America fight for democracy abroad while denying it to its own citizens at home? The pressure began to mount. Newspapers like the Pittsburgh Courier launched the Double V Campaign, V for victory against the Axis powers overseas, and the Fifth for victory against racism at home. This powerful idea resonated across the country. The relentless advocacy and the political pressure eventually forced the government's hand. In 1941, against the backdrop of a looming war and a rising tide of public demand, the U.S. Army Air Corps made a landmark decision. They would create an experimental program to train African American pilots. The location chosen for this experiment was a segregated airbase in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was a concession, a compromise born more from political necessity than a genuine belief in equality. The military establishment largely expected it to fail. They saw it as a way to quiet the critics, a token gesture that would ultimately prove their racist assumptions correct. They had no idea they were about to set the stage for one of the most remarkable stories in American history. They were about to witness the birth of a legend. This program, known as the Tuskegee Experiment, was designed to be an isolated trial, but for the determined young men who flocked to Alabama with dreams of soaring through the clouds, it was much more than that. It was a chance, a single, precious opportunity to prove everyone wrong. They were driven by a desire not just to fly, but to dismantle a century of lies with every takeoff and landing. The cadets who arrived at Tuskegee faced immense pressure. They knew they weren't just flying for themselves. They were carrying the hopes and aspirations of an entire community on their wings. Every flight, every exam, every drill was a battle against prejudice. They had to be better, smarter, and more disciplined than their white counterparts, because any mistake could be used as an excuse to shut the entire program down. The instructors, both black and white, held them to an incredibly high standard. The training was rigorous, the academic demands were intense, and the physical challenges were grueling. They were learning to fly complex aircraft like the PT-17 Stearman biplane, the Vultee BT-13 Valiant, and the advanced AT-6 Texan trainer. Beyond the cockpit, they studied meteorology, navigation, and engineering. They were being forged into officers and pilots, taught to lead and to fight in the unforgiving skies of war. They knew the world was watching, and they were determined to give them a show they would never forget. They were not just learning to be pilots, they were learning to be pioneers. This experiment, born from segregation and skepticism, would ultimately give rise to the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. These men would go on to shatter stereotypes, redefine courage, and carve out an undeniable legacy of excellence in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their story is not just about a battle fought in the skies over Europe. It's about the battle for the soul of a nation, fought right here at home. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen begins here in a divided America with a so-called experiment that was supposed to fail. But instead, it became the foundation for a revolution in the clouds. Join us as we continue to explore their incredible journey from the dusty airfields of Alabama to the heart of the war and discover how these trailblazers forever changed the face of the American military and the course of history. Have you ever heard the saying, "The deck was stacked against them"? Well, for a group of brave men in the 1940s, that wasn't just a saying. It was a reality. They lived every single day. Today, we're diving deep into the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. But not just the heroic dogfights you might know. We're going back to the very beginning, to a social experiment that was designed to fail. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1940s. America is on the brink of entering World War II, and the nation is deeply segregated. The U.S. military was no exception. The prevailing belief, held by many in positions of power, was that African Americans were intellectually and temperamentally unfit for combat roles, especially something as complex and demanding as flying a military aircraft. This wasn't just an opinion. It was official policy, backed by a deeply flawed and racist 1925 study from the Army War College. This study concluded that black people lacked the intelligence, courage, and leadership capabilities required to be pilots. It was a baseless, prejudiced document that served as a convenient excuse to maintain the status quo. But the winds of change were starting to blow, even if just a little. Civil rights organizations like the NAACP and influential black newspapers, most notably the Chicago Defender, launched a relentless campaign. They weren't just asking for a chance, they were demanding it. They argued that if African Americans were expected to be drafted and serve their country, they should have the right to serve in every capacity, including the most prestigious roles like pilots. The pressure mounted. Publicly, the War Department couldn't ignore the calls for equality, especially with a potential war looming. So, they came up with a plan, a so-called experiment. This is where the story takes a turn. On the surface, it looked like a victory for civil rights. The War Department announced it would create a program to train black pilots, but behind closed doors, the intention was far from noble. The entire program was built on a foundation of doubt and prejudice. The goal for many in the military establishment wasn't to create a new squadron of skilled pilots. It was to prove their racist theories correct. They wanted this experiment to fail spectacularly, so they could say, "See, we told you so." And the location they chose for this experiment tells you everything you need to know about their intentions. They picked Tuskegee, Alabama. Why Tuskegee? Not because it had the best facilities or the most strategic location. No, it was chosen for its isolation. Nestled in the deeply segregated South, the new training base, Tuskegee Army Airfield, was far from the prying eyes of northern journalists and activists. It was a place where the experiment could be controlled, where the cadets could be kept separate, and where failure could be carefully managed and documented. The choice of location was a deliberate act of sabotage from the very start. When the first class of cadets, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, arrived in 1941, they walked into a trap. The facilities were a world away from what their white counterparts enjoyed. They were given second-rate planes, often older models that were more difficult to fly and maintain. The resources were scarce. Everything from training manuals to spare parts was in short supply. They were being set up with hand-me-downs, expected to perform miracles with subpar equipment. But the most significant obstacle wasn't the old planes or the lack of supplies. It was the human element. The cadets were surrounded by a command structure filled with white officers who openly believed the program was a waste of time and money. Imagine being a young, ambitious cadet, eager to serve your country, and your commanding officer looks at you not as a future pilot, but as a foregone conclusion of failure. The psychological pressure was immense. They faced constant hostility, condescension, and a level of scrutiny that no other cadets had to endure. Every small mistake was magnified. Every success was dismissed as a fluke. The instructors, the commanders, the entire system was designed to break their spirit. There was a pervasive belief that the cadets would wash out, that they would lack the discipline for military life, the technical aptitude to master the complex machinery of an airplane, and the courage to fly into combat. The program was a pressure cooker designed to expose any and every perceived weakness. The training was rigorous, but layered on top of that was the immense weight of knowing that you weren't just fighting for your own wings. You were carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire community on your shoulders. If you failed, it wouldn't just be your failure. It would be used as evidence to deny opportunities to countless others for generations to come. But here's where the story defies its own script. The men of Tuskegee did something extraordinary. Faced with overwhelming odds and a system designed to see them fail, they refused to quit. Instead of breaking, they bonded. They formed a brotherhood, forged in the fires of adversity. They studied harder, trained longer, and pushed themselves beyond their limits. They knew they had to be better than perfect, just to be considered equal. The cadets showed a level of discipline that stunned their skeptical commanders. They meticulously maintained their second-hand aircraft, turning them into finely tuned machines. They mastered complex flight maneuvers and aerial gunnery with a precision that was undeniable. They supported each other, with the more advanced cadets tutoring those who were struggling. They created their own ecosystem of success within a larger system of failure. They didn't just meet the standards, they exceeded them. One of the most famous figures in this early phase was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who became the commander of the 99th and later the 332nd Fighter Group. Davis himself had faced years of isolation at West Point, where no one would speak to him or be his roommate. He knew what it was like to be an outsider, and he instilled in his men a sense of unwavering professionalism and determination. Under his leadership, the Tuskegee trainees proved, day in and day out, that skill, courage, and patriotism have no color. The establishment was shocked. The high washout rates they predicted never materialized. Instead, a steady stream of highly competent, disciplined, and eager pilots graduated from the program. They had taken every obstacle, every insult, every piece of second-rate equipment, and turned it into fuel. They disproved the very assumptions the experiment was meant to confirm. The test, built on doubt, had produced a result of undeniable excellence, but their fight was far from over. Graduating was one thing, being sent into actual combat was another. Even after proving their skills, the War Department was still hesitant to deploy them. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was eventually sent to North Africa, but they were initially given secondary missions, far from the main action. It was another test, another hurdle to overcome. They had proven they could fly. Now, they had to prove they could fight. And as we'll see, the legend of the Tuskegee Airmen, the legendary Red Tails, was just about to begin. The experiment designed to be their downfall had inadvertently created one of the most celebrated and effective fighting units in American history. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving deep into a story of incredible perseverance and skill, forged in the crucible of prejudice and expectation. We're talking about the training of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. Imagine this. You're a young, aspiring pilot in the 1940s, dreaming of soaring through the skies. But for African-American cadets, the path wasn't just about learning to fly. It was about proving an entire race's capability against a backdrop of systemic doubt. The training program at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama was deliberately designed to be one of the most demanding in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. We, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was eventually sent to North Africa, but they were initially given secondary missions, far from the main action. It was another test, another hurdle to overcome. The experiment designed to be their downfall had inadvertently created one of the most celebrated and effective fighting units in American history. Today, we're diving deep into a story of incredible perseverance and skill, forged in the crucible of prejudice and expectation. We're talking about the training of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. Imagine this. You're a young, aspiring pilot in the 1940s, dreaming of soaring through the skies. But for African-American cadets, the path wasn't just about learning to fly. It was about proving an entire race's capability against a backdrop of systemic doubt. The training program at Tuskegee The prevailing, deeply prejudiced belief at the time was that black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage to be military pilots. The program's architects, some of whom held these very beliefs, created a curriculum so tough that they expected a high failure rate. This wasn't just pilot school. It was a high-stakes social experiment where any mistake could be twisted and used as so-called proof of racial inferiority. The pressure on these young men was astronomical, far beyond what their white counterparts ever had to face. Every flight, every exam, every drill was a test not just of their abilities, but of their right to even be there. The daily life of a Tuskegee cadet was a relentless grind. Their days started before dawn and were packed with intense academic coursework. They studied everything from meteorology and navigation to physics and engine mechanics. These weren't simple overview classes. They were college-level courses crammed into a compressed timeline. On top of the academics, they had to master military discipline, enduring constant inspections and drills under the watchful eyes of their officers. And then there was the flight training itself. It was punishing. The instructors, many of whom were white officers and initially skeptical, held the cadets to an impossibly high standard. The slightest error in a maneuver, a moment of hesitation, or a miscalculation could lead to a washout, ending a pilot's dream right there. The psychological toll was immense. These cadets knew that their individual failure wouldn't just be their own. It would be used to discredit their entire community. They carried the weight of millions on their shoulders every time they climbed into the cockpit of a Stearman biplane for primary training. But here's where the story takes a powerful turn. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, the Tuskegee cadets rose to the occasion in a way that left their doubters speechless. They didn't just meet the standards, they consistently exceeded them. They studied harder, flew sharper, and demonstrated a level of discipline that was second to none. Many of the graduates from Tuskegee actually ranked in the top percentiles of their classes across the entire Army Air Forces. The cadets' performance was so undeniable that it forced a change in attitude among their instructors. These skeptical officers, who had come in expecting failure, were now witnessing some of the finest pilots they had ever trained. They couldn't help but acknowledge the sheer competence, skill, and unwavering determination of the men they were teaching. It was a quiet, powerful revolution happening right there on the dusty airfields of Alabama. The training pipeline was a multi-stage process. After mastering the basics in the PT-17 Stearman, they moved on to more advanced aircraft. They learned formation flying, aerobatics, and the fundamentals of aerial combat. In the vaulty BT-13 Valiant, an aircraft known as the vibrator for its tendency to shake violently. From there, they graduated to the AT-6 Texan, the standard advanced trainer for the Air Forces, where they honed their gunnery and tactical skills. Finally, they transitioned to the fighter planes they would fly in combat, like the P-40 Warhawk. Each stage was a filter, designed to weed out anyone not absolutely at the top of their game. Yet, hundreds of men successfully navigated this gauntlet. By 1943, the first group of these exceptional pilots had completed the program. They were no longer just cadets. They were a fully fledged, combat-ready fighter unit, the 99th Fighter Squadron. They had endured the crucible of Tuskegee and emerged not just as pilots, but as pioneers, ready to prove their worth not just in training, but in the skies over Europe. The establishment of the 99th Fighter Squadron was a monumental achievement. It was the first all-black fighter unit in U.S. military history. But their journey was far from over. Even after proving their skills, they faced resistance from high-ranking commanders who were reluctant to send them into combat. They were initially relegated to patrol duties in North Africa, far from the main action. But when they finally got their chance to engage the enemy, they performed with distinction, silencing many of their critics. The success of the 99th paved the way for the creation of a larger all-black unit, the 332nd Fighter Group, which would eventually become famous as the Red Tails for the distinctive crimson paint on their planes' tails. The legacy of their training is profound. The Tuskegee program didn't just create pilots, it created leaders and shattered stereotypes. The discipline, resilience, and excellence these men were forced to cultivate became the hallmarks of their service. They proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that with equal opportunity and training, African Americans could perform at the highest levels. Their success was a critical factor in President Truman's decision to desegregate the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948, a landmark moment in the American Civil Rights Movement. The story of their training is a powerful reminder that true strength is forged in adversity. They faced a system designed for them to fail, and instead, they soared. Imagine this. It is 1943. You're a pilot. One of the best. You've trained relentlessly, pushed yourself beyond every limit, and earned your wings against all odds. Now, you're finally deployed, ready to fight for your country. But when you arrive, the biggest battle isn't against the enemy in the sky. It's against the prejudice on the ground. This was the reality for the 99th Fighter Squadron, the first group of Tuskegee Airmen to see combat. Their journey to war began in the crucible of North Africa. After years of demanding training at Tuskegee, the pilots of the 99th were eager to prove their worth. They arrived in a theater of war that was hot, dusty, and unforgiving. Flying their Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, they were finally in the fight, but not in the way they had hoped. From the very beginning, they were met with a wall of skepticism, not from the enemy, but from their own side. Many senior white officers in the Army Air Forces were deeply prejudiced and had openly opposed the Tuskegee experiment. They didn't believe black men had the intelligence, courage, or skill to be combat pilots. So, instead of being sent on the glorious air-to-air combat missions they had trained for, the dogfights that made aces and heroes, the 99th was primarily assigned to ground attack missions. These were gritty, dangerous, and often thankless jobs. They strafed enemy supply lines, bombed troop concentrations, and provided close air support for soldiers on the front lines. It was vital work, but it wasn't what they signed up for. They were being kept on the sidelines, denied the chance to engage the enemy in the air. This decision wasn't just about strategy. It was a deliberate attempt to limit their opportunities and reinforce the racist belief that they were UN-capable fighter pilots. The pressure on these men was immense. They knew they weren't just flying for themselves or their squadron. They were flying for the future of every black American who dreamed of serving their country on equal footing. Every mission was a test, every flight scrutinized, and their commanding officer, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., felt this pressure more than anyone. He was a West Point graduate, a brilliant leader, and the son of the Army's first black general. He knew that the fate of the entire Tuskegee program rested on the performance of his men. It wasn't long before the whispers of doubt turned into official criticism. The commander of their parent fighter group, Colonel William Mamiere, was a vocal critic. He submitted a damning report claiming the 99th was inexperienced and lacked the killer instinct. He argued they were performing poorly and recommended they be removed from combat operations. This report was a bombshell. It was exactly what the opponents of the program had been waiting for, a legitimate reason to shut it all down. The news traveled all the way back to Washington, D.C., and the very existence of the Tuskegee Airmen hung in the balance. Think about the injustice. These pilots were risking their lives every day, flying into heavy anti-aircraft fire, only to be told they were UN good enough by commanders who never wanted them there in the first place. The report was demoralizing, but the men of the 99th refused to be broken. They kept flying, kept fighting, and kept their discipline. While the political battle raged back home, they continued their missions over the rugged terrain of North Africa and then into the fierce skies of Italy. They flew patrol missions over the Anzio beachhead, a critical and bloody battle. Here, they finally got their chance to prove their critics wrong in the most definitive way possible. On 2 consecutive days, in January 1944, pilots of the 99th shot down a total of 12 German fighters over Anzio, without a single loss of their own. This was an incredible feat, a stunning display of skill and courage that could not be ignored. Lieutenants Charis Bailey, Willie Ashley, and Leon Roberts were among the pilots who scored victories, proving that they were more than capable of holding their own against the battle-hardened Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the controversy over Colonel Mamiere's report was coming to a head. A hearing was called before the War Department's Advisory Committee. Colonel Davis was called back from the front lines to defend his squadron. He stood before the committee and, with calm, irrefutable logic, dismantled the criticisms. He presented data, mission reports, and statistics. He pointed out that the 99th had been given fewer opportunities for air-to-air combat than white squadrons, and that their primary role had been ground support, which naturally resulted in fewer aerial victories. But the most powerful defense came from an independent analysis. The War Department ordered a comprehensive review comparing the 99th S performance records to those of white P-40 squadrons operating in the same theater. The results were clear and undeniable. When evaluated fairly, based on the types of missions they flew and the opportunities they were given, the 99th Fighter Squadron was just as effective, just as skilled, and just as deadly as any other unit. The critical reports were proven to be based on prejudice and a skewed interpretation of the facts, not on reality. The vindication was complete. The attempt to sideline and discredit the Tuskegee Airmen had failed, because of their perseverance in the face of incredible adversity. Because of their undeniable success in the skies over Italy, the program was not only saved, it was expanded. This victory wasn't just won in a hearing room. It was won in the cockpits of their Warhawks, in the flak-filled skies over Anzio, and in the unwavering determination of men who refused to be defined by the color of their skin. Their performance under fire didn't just earn them respect. It paved the way for the creation of the all-black 332nd Fighter Group, who would go on to create their own legendary history as the Red Tails. The initial trial by fire in North Africa and Italy was the crucible that forged the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, proving to the world that courage knows no color. The Tuskegee Airmen's story is one of legends, but their most iconic chapter truly began with the rise of the Red Tails. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a symbol of hope, painted vividly across the skies of war-torn Europe. The 332nd Fighter Group, with their distinctive crimson-tailed P-51 Mustangs, were given one of the most dangerous and vital jobs of the entire air war, escorting American bombers. Let's set the scene. It's the height of World War II. Massive formations of American bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, are flying deep into enemy territory to strike at the heart of the German war machine. These missions were absolutely critical, but they came at a terrifying cost. The bombers were big, slow, and packed with explosives, making them prime targets for the swift, deadly German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190. The losses were catastrophic. Early in the war, bomber crews had a grimly low chance of completing their full tour of missions. Imagine being in one of those planes, hours from home, surrounded by flak, knowing that at any moment, enemy fighters could swarm you from any direction. The air was a maelstrom of machine gun, fire, and cannon shells. Bombers were falling out of the sky in staggering numbers. The 8th Air Force suffered such heavy casualties on some raids that it was almost unsustainable. The sky was a graveyard. This is where the Tuskegee Airmen enter the picture. When the 332nd Fighter Group was assigned to the 5th 10th Air Force in Italy, their primary mission was to protect these vulnerable bombers. They were the guardian angels. Now, the common practice for many fighter escort groups at the time was a bit different. Fighter pilots were aces in the making, young, aggressive, and eager to score aerial victories against enemy planes. It was a culture of kills. Many escort pilots would break formation, chasing after a German fighter for a chance at a personal victory, a kill tally, and the glory that came with it. While this took down enemy planes, it often left the bombers exposed and vulnerable. The commander of the 332nd, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., recognized this flaw. He instilled a revolutionary and incredibly strict doctrine in his pilots. The rule was simple, but it was ironclad. Never leave the bombers. Stay with them, no matter what. He drilled it into his men that their job was not to hunt for glory, but to bring the big friends, as they called the bombers, home safely. This wasn't about individual kill counts. It was about the collective mission. This discipline became the hallmark of the Red Tails. While other fighter groups might scatter to chase down German fighters, the Red Tails stuck to the bombers like glue. They flew a tight escort, weaving above, below, and around the bomber formations, creating a protective shield of steel and firepower. If enemy fighters approached, the Red Tails would engage them, drive them off, and then immediately return to their position beside the bombers. They refused to be baited away. This tactical discipline was against bomber crews, who are used to seeing their escorts disappear over the horizon, started noticing something different. They saw these fighters with the bright red tails staying with them all the way to the target and all the way back. A sense of relief and trust began to build. When bomber crews were being briefed for a mission, a common question became, who are our escorts today? And when the answer was the Red Tails, a wave of confidence would sweep through the room. They knew they had the best protection in the sky. The Tuskegee Airmen's reputation grew, not just from their discipline, but from their fierce effectiveness. They were skilled pilots, graduates of the grueling Tuskegee training program, and they were more than a match for the Luftwaffe. They engaged in countless dogfights, protecting their charges with a tenacity that became legendary. They flew some of the longest and most dangerous escort missions of the war, including missions deep into Germany to Berlin itself. There's a famous, though often debated, claim that the Red Tails never lost a single bomber they escorted. While historical analysis has shown this as strictly true, a small number of bombers were indeed lost to enemy fighters. On their watch their number was so remarkably low compared to other escort groups that it speaks volumes about their effectiveness. Their loss rate was a fraction of the average. They set a standard for bomber escort that was unmatched. They proved that disciplined, close escort was the key to saving lives and ensuring the success of the bombing campaign. Think about the pressure these men were under. They weren't just fighting the enemy. They were fighting prejudice at home. They knew that every mission was a test, that they had to be better than everyone else just to be considered equal. And under that immense pressure, they didn't just perform. They created a legacy of discipline, courage, and unparalleled success. The image of those red Mustangs flanking a formation of B-17s is one of the most powerful and enduring images of the air war in Europe. It represents a shift in aerial combat tactics, but more importantly, it represents a group of men who, when given the chance, proved to the world what they were capable of. Their dedication to the mission, their unwavering commitment to protecting the bombers, saved countless lives and played a crucial role in the Allied victory. The legend of the Red Tails wasn't built on myth. It was forged in the fires of combat through discipline, skill, and an unbreakable promise to always bring the big friends home. Imagine this: the skies over war-torn Europe, a terrifying canvas of flak, enemy fighters, and the constant roar of engines. For the Allied bomber crews, flying into the heart of Germany was a journey into the lion's den. Their survival often depended on the fighter escorts flying alongside them, their guardian angels in the sky. Among the most legendary of these guardians were the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of African-American pilots who flew with a determination forged in the fires of prejudice and a skill honed through relentless training. When the Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in the European theater, they weren't just fighting the enemy. They were fighting a deeply ingrained belief that they were inferior. They were an experiment, a test case that many in the military establishment expected to fail. But when they climbed into the cockpits of their iconic P-51 Mustangs, with their tails painted a distinctive, brilliant red, they didn't just fly, they soared, leaving all doubts and prejudices grounded far below. These weren't just any pilots. They were up against the Luftwaffe, Germany's elite air force, filled with battle-hardened veterans who had dominated the skies for years. The German pilots, flying formidable aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, were masters of aerial combat. To face them was to face the best of the best. The primary mission of the Red Tails, as they came to be known, was bomber escort. This was one of the most critical and dangerous jobs in the air war. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were slow, lumbering targets, vulnerable to swarms of agile German fighters. The job of an escort group was to form a protective shield around these bombers, engaging any enemy aircraft that dared to get close. It required incredible discipline, teamwork, and a unique kind of courage. Unlike fighter sweeps, where pilots sought out dogfights, escort duty demanded that they stick with the bombers, often sacrificing personal glory for the greater mission of getting the big friends home safely. And this is where the Tuskegee Airmen truly excelled. They developed a reputation for being incredibly disciplined and reliable. While some other fighter groups were known for breaking formation to chase after individual enemy planes and rack up personal victories, the Red Tails were famous for their steadfast dedication to the bombers. Bomber crews began to specifically request the Red Tails for their missions. Seeing those distinctive red-tailed Mustangs on their wing was a profound source of comfort and confidence. It meant they had the best protection in the sky. They knew the Red Tails wouldn't abandon them. This wasn't just a feeling. The numbers backed it up. While a popular myth arose that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a single bomber they escorted, the reality is even more impressive. No fighter group could claim a perfect record in the chaotic and deadly skies over Germany. The never lost a bomber myth, while a powerful piece of folklore, obscures the verifiable truth. According to official U.S. Army Air Force's records, the 332nd Fighter Group consistently had one of the lowest bomber loss rates of any escort group in the 15th Air Force. Over the course of more than 200 escort missions, often deep into enemy territory and against overwhelming odds, they lost significantly fewer bombers to enemy fighters than the average for their peers. Let's put that into perspective. We're talking about missions to some of the most heavily defended targets in the entire Third Reich. On March 24, 1945, the Tuskegee Airmen escorted a fleet of B-17s on a mission to a Daimler-Benz tank factory deep inside Berlin. This was a 1,600-mile round trip, one of the longest missions flown by the 15th Air Force. Over the target, they were met by a swarm of advanced German jet fighters, the formidable Messerschmitt Me-262s. These jets were faster and more heavily armed than any propeller-driven plane. In the ensuing battle, the Red Tails, flying their P-51 Mustangs, not only protected the bombers, but also managed to shoot down 3 of the German jets without losing a single one of their own fighters. This single mission showcased their incredible skill, courage, and tactical brilliance. They proved that a well-flown Mustang, in the hands of a determined pilot, could take on and defeat even the most technologically advanced aircraft of the time. Their success was a direct result of the tactics and leadership of their commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had endured years of isolation and prejudice. Davis instilled a philosophy of strict discipline and mission focus. He understood that the ultimate measure of their success was on the number of enemy planes they shot down, but the number of bombers they brought home. This disciplined approach, which became their trademark, was the key to their exceptionally low loss rates. They stuck close to the bombers, weaving a protective screen that enemy pilots found incredibly difficult to penetrate. The Red Tails' combat record is astounding. They flew over 15,000 individual sorties, destroyed or damaged over 400 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground, and wrecked countless locomotives, trucks, and even a German destroyer. They earned over 850 medals and commendations, including Distinguished Flying Crosses, Silver Stars, and Purple Hearts. But their most important victory wasn't tallied in enemy planes shot down or targets destroyed. Their greatest victory was won against the prejudice and racism that had tried to keep them on the ground. By proving their undeniable skill and courage in the crucible of combat, the Tuskegee Airmen shattered the racist myths that had plagued the American military for generations. They demonstrated that patriotism, bravery, and ability have no color. Their stellar performance was a crucial factor in President Harry Truman's decision to issue Executive Order 9981 in 1948, which officially desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces. Their legacy isn't just one of military achievement. It's a legacy of social change. They were pioneers who fought a war on 2 fronts, one against a foreign enemy in the skies over Europe, and another against injustice at home. The red on their tails became a symbol not just of their unit, but of their blood, their sacrifice, and their burning passion for freedom and equality. Their story is a powerful reminder that true excellence cannot be contained by prejudice, and that courage can change the world. Have you ever heard of a hero who wasn't celebrated? Imagine this. You're a bomber pilot in World War II. Flying deep into enemy territory, your life depends on the fighter planes escorting you. And there's one group you always ask for, by name. The Red Tails. You know that when they're guarding you, your chances of coming home are exponentially higher. These pilots were legends in the sky, known for their skill, discipline, and unmatched bravery. But here's the shocking part. On the ground, back at base, these very same heroes were treated like second-class citizens. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, a tale of courage without recognition. The Tuskegee Airmen weren't just fighting the enemy abroad. They were fighting a deeply ingrained prejudice at home and within their own military. When they returned from missions where they had just risked everything, they didn't come back to parades and pats on the back. They returned to a segregated military, a system that questioned their abilities before they even took off and refused to acknowledge their victories when they landed. They ate in separate mess halls, slept in separate barracks, and were often denied the basic respect afforded to other soldiers. Think about the sheer mental fortitude that requires to fly into the jaws of death, to engage in terrifying dogfights thousands of feet in the air, knowing that the very institution you're fighting for sees you as inferior. Promotions that were earned in combat were often mysteriously lost or delayed indefinitely, while other units had their praises sung. The achievements of the Tuskegee Airmen were met with a deafening silence from the top brass. Many high-ranking white officers simply refused to believe or acknowledge that these black pilots were not only capable, but were, in fact, among the very best. This resistance to their success was a calculated effort to maintain the status quo of racial segregation. The Tuskegee experiment, as it was initially called, was set up by many who expected it to fail. They believed it would prove that African Americans lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage to operate complex military aircraft. But the airmen didn't just succeed. They shattered every racist stereotype and low expectation thrown at them. Their combat record was exemplary. They flew over 15,000 individual sorties in Europe and North Africa and destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. But the most telling statistic, the one that truly defined their legacy, was their record as bomber escorts. The legend says they never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. While historical analysis has slightly revised this to a handful of losses, the number is still so astonishingly low compared to other escort groups that it's practically miraculous. This is why the bomber crews, the men whose lives were on the line, started specifically requesting red-tail escorts. They didn't care about the color of the pilot's skin. They cared about survival. Their reputation wasn't built on military propaganda or press release, because there were hardly any. Their fame grew organically, by word of mouth, from one grateful bomber crew to another. It was a reputation forged in the crucible of combat and sealed by the lives they saved. Imagine the frustration. You're known as the Red Tail Angels by the men you protect, yet you're denied a promotion that a less skilled white pilot receives automatically. You see articles celebrating other fighter groups, knowing your own squadron's achievements are being deliberately ignored. This wasn't just a lack of praise. It was an active suppression of their accomplishments. For the Tuskegee Airmen, victory in the air was only half the battle. The other half was a daily fight for dignity and respect on the ground. And yet, they persevered. They continued to fly with unparalleled professionalism. They maintained their discipline, kept their planes in immaculate condition, and executed their missions flawlessly. Why? Because they knew they were carrying the hopes of an entire community on their shoulders. They understood that their performance wasn't just about winning the war. It was about proving to a skeptical nation and a prejudiced military that black men were fully capable, fully American, and fully deserving of the right to fight and die for their country. Their success was a direct challenge to the system of segregation. Every enemy plane they shot down, every bomber they brought home safely, was a crack in the foundation of institutional racism. The irony is staggering. They were fighting for a country that espoused freedom and democracy while being denied those very things themselves. When the war ended, these decorated pilots returned home not to ticker-tape parades, but to Jim Crow laws. They had been heroes in the skies of Europe, but in many parts of America, they still couldn't vote freely, sit at a lunch counter, or even use the same water fountain as white citizens. The recognition they so richly deserved was delayed for decades. It wasn't until years later, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, that their story began to be told and their contributions fully appreciated. In 1948, their undeniable success was a major factor in President Truman's decision to issue Executive Order 9981, which officially desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces. Their skill and sacrifice had made it impossible to continue justifying segregation in the military. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that excellence knows no color. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, therefore, is one. It's a story of incredible military achievement under the most difficult circumstances. But it's also a powerful chapter in the long fight for civil rights in America. So when we talk about the Tuskegee Airmen, let's remember their full story. Let's remember the dogfights and the bomber runs. But let's also remember the silent struggle for recognition. Their reputation wasn't handed to them. It was earned in the most hostile of environments, both in the air and on the ground. They proved that true courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. It's about maintaining your dignity, excellence, and hope when your own side refuses to see your worth. Their legacy is a testament to the fact that greatness cannot be suppressed forever. Truth, like the red tails in the sky, eventually soars above it all. The smoke of World War II had cleared, and the sky over Europe was once again quiet. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the heroes of the red tails, it was time to come home. They returned, not to ticker-tape parades in every town, but to a chillingly familiar reality, a nation that celebrated their victory abroad while denying them basic dignity at home. Imagine that, for a moment. You've just spent years risking your life, flying through storms of anti-aircraft fire, and defending bomber crews against the best pilots the enemy could muster. You've proven your courage, your skill, and your patriotism beyond any doubt. You've seen your friends, your brothers in arms, make the ultimate sacrifice for freedom. And then you step off the boat or the plane, back on American soil, and you're told you can't sit at a certain lunch counter. You can't drink from a certain water fountain, and you have to use a separate, often inferior, entrance. This was the bitter irony, the profound injustice that greeted these decorated veterans. The very freedom they fought to secure for others was a dream, still deferred for themselves and their families. It was a slap in the face. These pilots, with thousands of hours of complex, high-stakes combat experience, were some of the most qualified aviators in the world. When the war ended, a new age of commercial aviation was dawning. Airlines were expanding, and they needed skilled pilots. Who better than the men who had protected the skies over Europe? Yet, when these heroes applied for jobs as commercial pilots, the doors were slammed shut. The color of their skin, not the content of their character or the quality of their logbooks, was the deciding factor. It was a heartbreaking and infuriating betrayal of their service. These men who had mastered the P-51 Mustang were barred from the cockpit of a passenger plane simply because of prejudice. But the story of the Tuskegee Airmen doesn't end in bitterness. It transforms into a story of resilience and change. While many individuals faced personal and professional rejection, their collective achievement had planted a seed that could not be ignored. Their service was a powerful, undeniable testament to the lie of racial inferiority. How could anyone argue that black men were incapable or unworthy when a group of them had just compiled one of the most impressive combat records of the entire war? They had shattered stereotypes with every enemy plane they downed, with every bomber crew they brought home safely. Their double V. Campaign victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism had achieved its first part, and now the battle for the second was about to intensify. The performance of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group became a cornerstone of the argument for desegregation. Their success was documented, studied, and discussed at the highest levels of the government and the military. It provided irrefutable proof that segregation wasn't just morally wrong. It was inefficient and detrimental to the nation's strength. You couldn't look at the Tuskegee Airmen's record, the low number of bombers lost under their escort, the distinguished unit citations, and justify a segregated military. Their excellence in the crucible of war exposed the deep flaws in the system. They had proven, under the most intense pressure imaginable, that skill, bravery, and patriotism knew no color. This evidence was a crucial weapon in the hands of civil rights activists and progressive leaders who were pushing for change. When President Harry S. Truman began to seriously consider desegregating the armed forces, the Tuskegee Airmen's record was Exhibit A. Their story was a moral and logical imperative for integration. In 1948, just 3 years after the end of the war, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. This landmark order officially abolished racial discrimination in the United States Armed Forces. It was a monumental step forward, a direct result of the pressure built by the actions and sacrifices of countless individuals, with the Tuskegee Airmen standing as prominent, shining examples. Their fight in the skies of Europe had directly contributed to breaking down barriers on the ground back home. The path to full integration was not immediate or easy. The implementation of Truman's order faced resistance, and it took years for the military to truly become an integrated institution. But the first, most critical blow against segregation in the armed forces had been struck, and the Tuskegee Airmen's legacy was etched into that victory. They had fought a war on two fronts, and on both, they had emerged as agents of profound change. Their impact went far beyond the military. Their story inspired a generation of African Americans to dream bigger, to fight for their rights, and to break through barriers in every field imaginable. They became role models, proving that with determination and excellence, even the most deeply entrenched systems of prejudice could be challenged and overcome. Men like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had led the airmen in combat, continued to serve with distinction in the newly integrated Air Force, rising to the rank of four-star general. Others, though denied careers in aviation, became doctors, lawyers, educators, and business leaders, carrying the discipline and confidence they had gained during the war into their civilian lives. They became leaders in their communities, continuing the fight for civil rights on a local and national level. They had been told they weren't good enough, and they responded by becoming the best. They returned to a country that didn't fully accept them, and they worked tirelessly to make that country live up to its own ideals of liberty and justice for all. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen's return is a powerful reminder that victory in war is not the end of the story. The fight for justice and equality is an ongoing battle, one that requires the same courage and perseverance they showed in the skies. Their legacy is not just in the battles they won, but in the barriers they broke. They returned as heroes, and even when their nation failed to treat them as such, they continued to serve, to lead, and to inspire, paving the way for the generations that would follow. They proved that true patriotism is not just about defending your country from foreign enemies, but also about striving to make it a better, more just place for all its citizens. Have you ever heard of an experiment that was designed to fail, but instead it changed the course of history? That's the incredible story of the Tuskegee Airmen. Let's rewind to the early 1940s. The world is at war, but back in the United States, another battle is raging. The fight against racial segregation. At the time, the U.S. military was deeply segregated, and a widespread racist belief held that African Americans were not intelligent or disciplined enough to fly complex military aircraft. It was a deeply ingrained prejudice, unsupported by fact, but powerful enough to keep black men out of the cockpit. To supposedly test this theory, the U.S. Army Air Corps launched a controversial program in 1941 at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. This became known as the Tuskegee Experiment. The unspoken expectation from many in power was that this program would fail, thereby proving their racist assumptions and justifying the continued segregation of the military. They set the bar incredibly high, making the training and qualification standards just as rigorous, if not more so, than those for white pilots. The deck was stacked against them from the very start. But something amazing happened. Instead of failing, the men who came to Tuskegee soared. They were determined, brilliant, and fiercely patriotic. These cadets, ground crew, mechanics, and support staff faced immense pressure, not just from the demanding training, but from the constant weight of prejudice. They knew they weren't just flying for themselves, they were flying for the future of all African Americans. Every success was a blow against systemic racism. Every flight was a statement. Soon, the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and later the 332nd Fighter Group, were ready for combat. Sent to the European theater of World War II, they were initially given older planes and assigned less critical missions. But their skill was undeniable. Flying P-47s and later the iconic P-51 Mustangs, which they painted with distinctive red tails, they quickly earned a fearsome reputation. They became known as the Red Tails. Their primary role became bomber escort missions, one of the most dangerous jobs a fighter pilot could have. Their task was to protect Allied bombers from enemy fighters on long, perilous raids deep into Germany. The bomber crews, who were overwhelmingly white, initially didn't even know their protectors were black pilots. All they knew was that when the Red Tail Angels, as they called them, were flying alongside them, they had a much better chance of making it home. The Tuskegee Airmen flew with a unique combination of discipline and daring. They were instructed to stick close to the bombers, a tactic that differed from other fighter groups who often broke formation to chase enemy planes for individual glory. This disciplined approach paid off. The legend grew that the 332nd Fighter Group never lost a single bomber they escorted to enemy fighters. Now, while historical records show a very small number of bombers were lost, their escort record was, without a doubt, the best in the entire 15th Air Force. Their success rate was phenomenal and shattered every racist myth about their capabilities. They flew over 1,500 missions, destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, and earned more than 850 medals and commendations, including numerous distinguished flying crosses. They proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that skill, courage, and patriotism have nothing to do with the color of a person's skin. They weren't just fighting the Axis powers abroad, they were fighting Jim Crow at home. When the war ended, the airmen returned to a country that still treated them as second-class citizens. They were celebrated as heroes in Europe, but faced the same old segregation and discrimination back in the United States. However, their story could not be ignored. Their undeniable record of excellence in combat became a powerful argument for desegregation. How could the military justify segregating men who had proven themselves to be among the very best? The success of the Tuskegee Airmen created a ripple effect that reached the highest levels of government. It provided concrete, irrefutable evidence that segregation was not only morally wrong but also weakened the nation's military effectiveness by excluding capable individuals. Their performance put immense pressure on military and political leaders to re-evaluate the segregationist policies that were still in place. This brings us to a pivotal moment in American history. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981. This landmark order stated, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment, an opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." This was the official end of racial segregation in the United States military. While many factors contributed to this historic decision, historians and civil rights scholars universally agree that the exemplary record of the Tuskegee Airmen was a crucial catalyst. They were the living proof that made the argument for integration impossible to refute. The experiment designed to be a footnote of failure had instead become a headline of triumph. They had taken on the dual enemies of fascism abroad and racism at home, and they had won. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen extends far beyond military history. They broke barriers and paved the way, not just for future generations of black military personnel, but for the wider civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the following decades. They inspired countless individuals to dream bigger and fight for their rights. They showed the world that excellence cannot be confined by prejudice and that courage can change the world. So, the next time you see a P-51 Mustang with a red tail, remember the story behind it. It's a story of struggle, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph. It's the story of the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew for freedom in the skies of Europe and, in doing so, helped secure a greater degree of freedom for everyone back home. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, determination and excellence can dismantle the highest walls of injustice. In the skies over a war-torn Europe, they flew with a purpose that went far beyond the battlefield. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, and their legacy is one that transcends the very clouds they mastered. Today, we're not just concluding a story about fighter pilots, we're celebrating the enduring triumph of the human spirit. Let's step back for a moment. Imagine the world in the early 1940s, a world rife with conflict, but also deeply divided by race. In America, segregation was the law of the land, and the military was no exception. The prevailing belief, a deeply ingrained and baseless prejudice, was that African Americans lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline to fly sophisticated combat aircraft. The Army Air Corps was a whites-only club. But change was coming, sparked by the tireless efforts of civil rights activists and the pressing need for more pilots as war loomed. Under pressure, the War Department initiated a controversial experiment, a program to train black pilots in Tuskegee, Alabama. It was called the Tuskegee Experiment, a name that carried the weight of skepticism. Many in power expected, and perhaps even hoped, for Ethiopia. They couldn't have been more wrong. From these humble and hostile beginnings rose a group of men who would rewrite history, the pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Pursuit Squadron, along with the thousands of navigators, bombardiers, mechanics, nurses, cooks, and other support personnel, proved that excellence knows no color. They faced a two-front war, one against the Axis powers in the sky, and another against racism on the ground. Their performance in combat was nothing short of legendary, flying iconic planes like the P-40 Warhawk, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and most famously, the P-51 Mustang with its distinctive red-painted tail. They earned the nickname Red Tails. Their primary mission was bomber escort, one of the most dangerous and critical jobs in the air war. They were tasked with protecting Allied bombers on long, perilous raids deep into enemy territory. And protect them they did. The Tuskegee Airmen developed a reputation for their discipline and unwavering dedication. Unlike some fighter groups, where pilots might break formation to chase individual glory, the Red Tails stuck to their bombers. They became a symbol of safety, a welcome sight for the bomber crews who came to specifically request them as their little red-tailed friends. The myth that they never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters is just that, a myth, born from the overwhelming success and relief of the bomber crews they protected. But the reality is just as impressive. Their loss rates were extraordinarily low, far below the average for other escort groups in the 5th 10th Air Force. Over the course of more than 200 missions, they proved their mettle time and time again, destroying over 100 enemy aircraft in the air and many more on the ground. Their valor earned them numerous accolades, including more than 150 distinguished flying crosses. But their victory wasn't just measured in enemy planes downed or bombers saved. Their greatest victory was a social one. When the war ended, these men returned home not to a hero's welcome, but to the same segregation and discrimination they had left behind. Yet, they carried themselves with a newfound dignity and an unshakable confidence. They had proven they were not just equal, but exceptional. The stellar combat record of the Tuskegee Airmen was an undeniable argument against segregation. It became a powerful catalyst for President Harry S. Truman's decision in 1948 to issue Executive Order 9981, which officially desegregated the United States Armed Forces. This was a monumental step forward in the American civil rights movement, and the Red Tails were at the forefront of that change. Their success cracked the foundations of institutionalized racism in America. The years passed, and for a long time, their story was largely overlooked, a footnote in the grand narrative of World War II. But truth has a way of rising to the surface. Through the persistent efforts of the airmen themselves, historians, and advocates, their story began to be told. It was a story that America needed to hear. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are rightly honored as pioneers of both military excellence and social justice. Their legacy is cemented in the national consciousness. In 2007, in a long-overdue ceremony at the U.S. Capitol, the surviving members were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the nation. It was a powerful moment of recognition, a nation finally acknowledging the debt it owed these heroes. All across the country, their legacy lives on. Museums, like the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Alabama, preserve their artifacts and tell their story to new generations. Documentaries, books, and academic studies now recognize them as one of the most significant and impactful units of the entire war. We see their influence in the diverse faces that now make up the United States military, a direct result of the doors they forced open. Their story is not just about thrilling dogfights and aerial combat. It's a profound lesson in perseverance. It's about facing down impossible odds with unwavering determination. It's about maintaining dignity in the face of dehumanizing prejudice. It is, ultimately, the story of how truth, courage, and excellence can triumph over ignorance and hate. They were asked to be the best under the worst of circumstances, and they delivered against the formidable German Luftwaffe and the insidious poison of racism. They flew with skill and honor. They didn't just win battles in the air. They won a war for the soul of a nation. They prevailed. Their legacy is a reminder that heroes are not defined by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character and the courage of their actions. The story of the Tuskegee Airmen is a timeless and uniquely American story. A story of struggle, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph that continues to inspire us all.